my opponent plays e4. So the preparation here I had was pretty vague, right? I was obviously looking for a fight, so that's why, of course, I played the Sicilian, Sicilian Khan, Sicilian Paulsen, whatever you title it. I mean, e6 with knight c6 or a6 ideas, which is essentially one of my chessable courses. Yeah, and g3. You know, this essentially feels like my opponent is using my weapons against me, because I've been a very vocal advocate of this variation for white. And I even went as far that I named it the Baltic variation. Why? Well, because it doesn't really bear an official name, and we had this discussion. Some people say it's the Adams variation. Well, I disagree. I don't really see how Adams has anything to do with the popularity of this line. But I noticed that a lot of Baltic players, they play this line, and that's why I felt that after I wrote my one of the first commercial courses for modern chess, I decided I can name it. All right. So that's why I decided to go for a fight, and in the course I advocate d5. The point is, after d5, e takes on d5, e takes on d5, white plays d4 and creates an isolated pawn. And then with bishop g2, he tries to, with moves like knight c3, sometimes try to get to this pawn on d5. Which probably is something that I would play. But then again, I felt that this is a too simple choice, right? And I have to choose something more complex. So instead, I played knight c6, bishop g2, knight f6, hitting the pawn. He can't play e5, knight g4, queen c7, the pawn on d4, the pawn on e5 will be in trouble. d3 is a choice, there's also a queen e2 move, d3, and now the big question. The big question is, do I go for the King's Indian attack setup myself? Because, well, guess what? This is my last chessable course again. I mean, after d5, white plays knight e2 or queen e2. And I decided, okay, I mean, I'm not going to do it because there was a different idea I wanted to test. I play d6, which is what I recommend in my Sicilian Khan course on Chessable. Bishop e7, rook e1, castle c3. And here the main continuation, according to the analysis of Igor Kovalenko, because he was essentially the brains of the course and I was like, the guy who was moderating it and putting his wisdom into words, he was recommending h6. A smart waiting move, just in case, taking care of the g5 square. And it's quite difficult for white to react accordingly. Because if he plays something like knight e2 or knight a3, not always this knight stands so well. So you're wondering, why not d4? Well, I guess you have to play d4. But the point is, after d5, I put my knight to d4, right? And then after queen b6, bishop d7, I get a very nice French game. And look at this. Actually, I greatly benefit from protecting this g5 square from all kinds of knight g5, bishop g5 flash outs in future. So if I would do this immediately, if I would do this right here, I would play d5. You're probably wondering, what's the difference? The difference is he will play e5. I can't play knight e4. And after knight e7, he could play something like, not really sure, maybe queen e2, h4, bishop f4, knight e2, knight f1, knight h2, knight g4, the typical King's Indian attack. So that's why this h6, it's a really smart move. And I was thinking, should I play this? But then again, I'm thinking, I'm definitely the favorite of this game. I have to try to win this game. And if I play h6, my opponent gets an easy game. And I recall there was an alternative in the course, which was rather risky, but I think it's exactly what I need for this game. And I went for it. I play b5. Now, b5 leads to some very interesting lines. Because if he plays e5 and tries to exploit the spin, you're wondering, did black just commit a mistake? Actually, no. I take it and I'm willing to sacrifice the exchange. So I felt this is really nice. I mean, asking white a lot of direct questions. Do you want to accept exchange? Because I take on d3, hit the rook, and let's say you do something like rook e2, c4, bishop c5, knight e5, queen b6, rook d8, exchange for a pawn, and the monster knight on d3. So I think this is really great for black. Maybe something like even e5, e4, bishop g4, bishop h3. A lot of possibilities. But that's why my opponent didn't really want to go here. He played e4, seemingly anticipating I'm going to play d5, e5, knight e4. But now I play a different idea. I play bishop b7. And again, black is very active in the center. I mean, white controls the central pawns, but he's underdeveloped. And it's quite difficult for white to do anything real. Because if he plays e5, I play knight e5. I'm going to take it, I'm going to take it. The position is going to resemble some sort of a Sicilian lapin. Look at my pieces, they're really standing nicely. Alternatively, I mean, of course, d5 has to be played, and this is what he chose in the game. If he plays something like knight e2, I'm not entirely sure how I'm supposed to continue. It could be something like queen b6, hitting the pawn, knight f1, and perhaps d5, e5, knight e4, followed with some aggressive advancement at the queen side. I think this is just great. So my opponent went for the critical choice, d5, which I was kind of hoping he's not going to find. He did. Takes, knight a5. And now the big question is how to properly value this position. The pawn on d5 remains under attack, and it seems white has to protect it. Apparently my opponent had to start with knight a3, which he didn't know, allowing these pawns to be traded, and the position is about balanced, although white has a slightly better pawn structure. He played knight h4, protecting the pawn on d5 and also thinking about knight f5 ideas. I play queen d7. And you know, the funniest thing about this position, when we are writing the course, me and Igor Kovalenko, there was one game played at the highest level between Kovalenko and Amin Bassem, the Egyptian grandmaster, the good doctor from Egypt, the only player in the history of African chess to reach 2700 elo, very good player, very nice guy by the way. And Kovalenko, the co-author of the course, played it against Bassem. And why I mention this, Bassem is in the room and he is our direct competitor for the opposing team. I mean, not the team we're playing, but the direct rivals for the championship. So he plays for Team Vasa and he sits like 5 meters from the game. You know, and I can't just stop smiling whenever he passes, right? Because I know he knows this game. I know that I'm basically repeating his game against Kovalenko. So it's quite funny. I mean, it's only us who knew it. So queen d7. Now, naturally the problem is this knight on a5, right? So I think it makes sense somehow to try to imprison it. But there's all kinds of tricks, right? For example, let's say he plays b3, I play rook e8, and he plays knight a3 with the idea to play c4, bishop b2, try to lock out the knight on a5 from the game. Well, you always need to be careful not to blunder the following idea. Check this out. Bishop d5. Take it. So what's the big idea? Take it. Take it. And now, if white makes this awful mistake and accepts the bishop, this actually would be a mate on the board. Right? So that's why white cannot accept the bishop. On h4, he would have to play something like bishop e3 or bishop f4, hit the pawn on d6, c5, and with the queen on d5 and the poor knight on a5, white is simply just doing fine. But again, I mean, this is something you have to see from afar. So after the game, I told to my opponent, I saw this idea of knight e5, and yeah, he said he saw it as well. Yeah, so this good he was. And also there's extra ideas like knight g4, hitting the bishop, with bishop f6, knight e5. So it's not really obvious that white will be in time to play c4 while being underdeveloped. So my opponent played pretty human. He played knight a3, rook e8, and, well, I guess he needs to develop. He played knight c2. In the aforementioned game, Bassem against Kovalenko, Amin played b4, and after knight c4, black was completely fine. I don't remember how they finished the game. I think Bassem won. Yeah, but it doesn't really matter because the opening was just fine for black. Knight c2, knight c4. I fixed the problem of the knight. I'm ready to go to knight b6 and hit the pawn on d5 in earnest. Think about also ideas like bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. Very nice active pieces. He played b3. And now the big choice. Where to go? Where should I go? Knight b6 or knight e5? Very, very tough choice. So I'm initially thinking knight b6 is the way to go. Why? Because I'm hitting the pawn on d5 immediately. He will play knight e3. I will play bishop f8 with idea like g6, bishop g7. Hey, Dr. Ahmed Sayed, knight b6 better, you think so? I don't know. But you know what? I was slightly concerned that he's going to play c4. For example, I'm going to go after this pawn on c4. And there might be a scenario when he's willing to sacrifice this pawn on c4. Because he has so many pieces at a king set attack. For a potential king set attack, right? So this is something you can't really calculate. I mean, when you're starting to play at a good level, you feel it, right? It's your subconscious knowledge, your experience from the previous games. You're like, it's risky, yeah? Yeah, it's risky. So I don't want to test it. And that's why this knight b6, as much as tempting it is, it feels that knight e5 is safer. Because knight e5 comes with the idea to play c4 and knight e3. Hitting the rook, hitting the bishop, and also attacking the pawn on d5. So I was thinking, if I plays f4, which kind of makes sense, knight g6, he can't retreat because the pawn on d5 is under attack. And now I evaluated this position to be simply better for black. Yeah, so I'm threading some knight e4 ideas, rook b8 ideas, and his position is, what's the right word? It's sort of loose. Yeah, I mean, it's disconnected. It's not really clear what his pieces are doing. The weaknesses are there. Okay, maybe he positions his bishop on b2 to do what exactly? The knight on e3 is weird. The bishop on g2 is weird. The weakness on e4 is there. So I would be totally happy to go here. And it's understandable he didn't go here. But I was expecting he's going to play knight e3. So this was my expectation. He wants to play c4, bishop b2. And yeah, now I was not sure what to make of this. For example, I play c4. B takes, I want to occupy the d3 square. And he just plays something like rook b1. If I play knight e3, he plays rook e2. My pawn on c4, by the way, is under attack. If I play bishop a6, he plays something like knight f5, knight e4, knight c6, by the way. Yeah, so again, not very clear game. But this is exactly what I wanted to get. And I was expecting he's going to play knight e3. And now he suddenly plays bishop f4. And I'm like, you know, usually when somebody plays something I don't expect, I'm naturally very surprised. But with this move came together the feeling something is not right with White's choice. I can't explain it, especially since I was so sure that knight e3 is the right continuation here. Something did not ring correctly with bishop f4. And the first thought I had in my mind, is he even threatening to take on e5 at all? So I was of course thinking about bishop f8, with the idea to play g6, bishop g7. If he hits it, he plays c4. He has a nice protected pass pawn in the center. But I'm about to play g6, e4, h5, bishop h6, knight g4, e3, etc. I don't know. You know, it looked really promising. But then I noticed an idea. And the idea was, what has changed? I mean, I can still fight for the d3 square, right? And since I had the idea that perhaps bishop e5 is not even a threat, well, 2 plus 2 is 4. I sacrifice an exchange. No, not an exchange, I sacrifice the pawn. And now, suddenly, white is in trouble. Because knight e3 is not only hitting the rook on e1, but also the bishop and f4, which would spoil his pawn structure. With the bishop on c1, maybe knight e3 wouldn't be that much of a threat. But with bishop f4, knight e3 now becomes a more sinister idea. So he took on c4, he took on e5, and now he was not really sure what to do. Because if he accepts this pawn, look at this. I play bishop c5, and suddenly all of black's pieces spring to life with incredible force. First, the rook on e5 is under attack. How do you defend? If you play queen e2, watch out for bishop f2. There's all kinds of knight g4 check ideas. A fork, right? And if you just lose the pawn on f2, black just keeps 2 bishops, an open position, and an exposed white king. So let me show it to you. King f2, rook e5, queen e5 would be a very obvious fork. So you have to be tactically alert in variations. Alright, so you can't really play queen e2. What else is there? That's a tough question because knight f3 is still bishop f2. Okay, what else is there? Maybe take on e8, rook takes on e8, but I'm not only threatening knight g4 but also bishop d5. And if I get this pawn back, I'm simply having very nice active pieces and white has a weak pawn on c3 with disconnected knights. Hello there viewers, welcome. So, yeah, I mean, he was thinking here for quite a while. And by the way, the pawn on d5 is under attack. So you see how his problems become bigger and bigger because he solved one problem of knight e3. Now there's a problem with the pawn on d5. So he played d6, which was an interesting idea because the point is bishop d6, bishop b7, queen b7. I dropped the bishop on d6, so I cannot do that. So I played bishop g. I was thinking about bishop g2, take it. I was thinking about taking and play bishop e4 to take this pawn on e7, but I started to dislike knight a3. Knight a3, knight c4, knight b5, knight e6. And one thing I can tell you for sure in my career, those pawns on e7, if you don't take it immediately, they tend to create problems later. So by definition, if you can't take it like in 1-2 moves, it's trouble, right? So don't even go there because there's always going to be something. So that's my gut instinct said, okay, I cannot do this. Although it was very tempting, for example, also to go here. You know, queen h3, knight g2, knight g4, and try to checkmate. But then again, I didn't really see where's the mate. For example, here, king f1, and I'm just lacking pieces. By the way, the pawn on e7 still stands. I have no time for any rook e6 or rook f6. So, I was considering all kinds of ideas, but alright, I decided just to play bishop f8 because the pawn on d6 is still under attack. He took on b7, I took on b7, he played knight e3, hitting the pawn on c4, I play queen c6. And now, again, white faces a very tough question. How exactly do you plan to defend the pawn on d6? It's a major weakness. Well, the first question, you should play knight f5. I mean, the first idea, right? Defend the pawn. And I'm thinking, after g6, I'm doing really great. The knight goes away, knight e7, takes, rook e7, doing great. Then I start to calculate further. I know this knight g4, hitting the knight on f6. And I'm thinking, how exactly I'm going to take this pawn? Knight e5 is queen d5, knight f6 fork ideas. There's no link, pirate person. It was not available online. I'm thinking I could take it and take it. I can't play queen c8, hitting the knight and hitting the pawn on d6. Boom. Boom, you're down a queen. Right, so you need to be tactically alert, also calculating the lines for your opponent. And that's why after knight f5, it took me a while I was calculating to see the move h5. I mean, taking care of the g4 square. To make sure there's no knight g4, I'm limiting this knight on e3, and the next move is going to be g6. Was I feeling a bit nervous, keeping the pawn on d6 for so long uncontested? Absolutely. But I tried to calculate any forcing lines, and I just did not see a single way how white can make a progress, and my next move is g6 anyway. Or rook d8 for that matter, maybe rook d8, bishop d6, or g6. I push away the knight, I take the pawn on d6 with all the spoils of war. So, he played queen e2. And you know, here I was thinking, I don't really care about the pawn on c4. So first idea I had was to play bishop d6, knight c4, and bishop c5. If he takes on e5, you already know the motive. Takes, bishop f2. King f2, knight g4 is a fork, and king f1, well, I don't know, queen h1, take on e1, take on h2. White's position is just collapsing. Then I was thinking he might take with a queen. And I don't really want to trade queens because I have bishop c5, I have knight e4, knight g5, or knight e2 ideas. He has all kinds of weaknesses at the light squares. But the more I was looking at this position, I realized he has access to knight f5. Bishop e3, knight e3, he just in time protects the queen on c4. And if I play rook c8, hitting the queen, with bishop e3, bishop f2 idea, he plays queen h4. And suddenly, actually, white is doing pretty much alright. I mean, why should be actually he much worse? He has some ideas here, like queen g5. So this is the reason why I included rook c8. Not really to protect the pawn on c4, but to make sure. If he plays rook d1, which he did, after bishop d6, queen c4, bishop c5. You see, instead of knight f5, he has included rook d1. He has no time for queen h4. Because if he plays knight f5 now, I take it, the queen is under attack. If he takes it, I make an intermezzo check, I collect his pawn, and two connected passed pawns in the center should decide the fate of the game in favor for black. So that was the big idea. I was pretty proud I found it. I didn't really care about the pawn on c4. All I really care that he doesn't have a counterplay at the king side. But you know, it's quite interesting because his idea why ultimately he played knight g4 and why he did not play queen c4. Now this was really interesting. He thought, I'm gonna go for this endgame. Which I thought it's a possibility, but white is so active here, I have a very serious suspicion here that it's just not enough to win the game. So I have to go something like rook c7, he plays knight f5. Alright, I keep my pawn, but he's very, very active here. Some knight e6, knight b5 ideas, it's just one pawn, right? Just one pawn. And throughout my career, I've convinced myself more than once that if you start worrying too much about the pawns and you lose your grasp on the greater picture, you let slip your advantage. So that's why here I was not really considering to take on c4. I was, like I was saying, playing bishop c5 with the idea if I get the pawn, I get two connected passed pawns. And if he goes away, well, I don't know, something like knight e4, hitting the pawn, g6, knight g5, very nice game. It's a material equality, but this material equality is more promising than that endgame with an extra pawn. Would you do the same? Because I have repeated the same mistake. I have made the same mistake when I was less experienced before. So he played knight g4, which was quite a tricky idea. Yeah, by the way, there was also one more idea I wanted to mention. Let me check it. Where was this? Yeah, so bishop d6, knight g4. Yeah, I found this very nice move, bishop c5. Yeah, bishop c5. And I was thinking, if he plays knight f5, how do I deal with this short-term initiative? Yes, simplifying too early is a mistake. For example, if I now play g6, or if I now play h5. Yeah, h5, by the way, same idea. Rook e5, bishop f2, knight g4. You're thinking it's the same, right? That's what I call a cold shower. Rook d6, knight f6, queen h5, and I don't think I can win the game. Check. I should be actually very happy if I make a draw here. Yeah, I saw this. I saw this during the calculation. So queen h3, rook g4. Oh my goodness. I mean, this extra rook is totally useless. Very nice idea. So after knight f5, I understood that h5 is not going to work because of rook d6. But queen e6 deals with rook d6 because now queen is to the connected to the defense, and I just simplify the position. So you have to be always tactically careful. So I played bishop c5, very nice attacking move. He played rook d2, which was, yeah, a slightly mysterious move. And again, I want to simplify. You know, I want to simplify, I want to take on g4. But if I do this, I activate his pieces. So the fight is not over. I need some precise moves first. He wants to play knight f5, he wants to play rook e2. And you know, it's very easy to become passive with an extra pawn. For example, you play g6, he plays rook e2, you play bishop d6, he plays knight f5. I've seen it happen so many times. You get the pawn, and suddenly you become very passive. I mean, nothing has changed. So you still need very active moves. I was also thinking about e4 with knight g4, e3 ideas, but I realized knight f5 is very strong, and I actually limit the power of my bishop because white is going to position his knight on d4. And finally, I found a very nice move. I found g6, which not only makes a window for the king, but I take away the f5 square for the knight. And most importantly, I set a devilish trap. So, you're looking at this move g6, you're wondering, what is wrong with knight e5? Because after knight e5, rook e5, and queen e5, there is no bishop f2. The rook protects it, there is no fork on g4. So you're wondering, oh wait, but there's rook e8, right? Rook e8 hit the queen on e5 and hit the rook on e1, and you can't really move anywhere to defend it. And I saw he can take on e8. He can play rook d8, pinning the knight. And now, if I play bishop f2, king f2, my opponent saw from afar that queen b6 check, hitting the rook and hitting the king, is not working because of rook d4. What he missed is not queen b6, queen f6. Same idea. Same idea, hitting the king on f2 and the rook on d8, and white is lost. So actually this knight takes on e5 was unforced error. He shouldn't have done that. And after rook e5, queen e5, rook e8, well, black was in time trouble. He understood. He missed queen f6 from afar, and he simply had to resign, right? Because indeed, if this idea doesn't work, black is simply essentially up an extra piece, because you, let's say here, you see white has two rooks for the queen, but I have one more minor piece. So that's why he resigned, because he understood this game is essentially over. Yeah, and then after the game we discussed that sure, knight e5 was a mistake, but both of us, we agreed that probably white already is strategically losing, because if he cannot take on e5, and for example, if he plays something like knight f6 and queen f6, you see the major difference to some of those side lines I showed you before is I simplified my position, but I did not give up my positional advantage.